afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Ippoliti, and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Learning Services here at the library. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon and to introduce our speaker, David Peters. An Oklahoma resident for 47 years, David Peters is the head of the Archives Department at the Oklahoma State University Library. David was born in Manhattan, Kansas, attended schools in Ames, Iowa, and graduated from high school in Stillwater. David served as a Peace Corps volunteer and agricultural extension agent in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and as a Peace Corps trainer for programs in several West African countries. Peters has degrees from Oklahoma State University and the University of Oklahoma. He has worked at the OSU Library for over 32 years, having served in the General Reference Department, Map Room, and the Archives. David is the author of one book about the OSU campus, co-author of 2 other books, and has contributed 50 articles about OSU history for State Magazine. He's a recipient of the OSU Distinguished Service and the Excellence in the Advancement of the Land Grant Mission Awards. He's currently serving on the boards of the Oklahoma Archivists Association, the Payne County Historical Society, Stillwater History Museum, and Pleasant Valley School. And with that, I would like to introduce David Peters. Thank you.
It seems like just 3 or 4 weeks ago that David Oberhelman talked to me about doing a presentation. Actually, it was probably 3 or 4 years ago. At that point, I'd done one story on one OAMC graduate who had served in World War I. We converted a series of questionnaires from World War I soldiers who had been students here to a digital platform on Content DM that Sarah Coates, who is now in the University of Florida, had worked on. And so we thought we'd put together just a little kind of dog and pony show. Well, this thing has grown since then. And so what's happening today, hopefully it's fairly informal. I have written remarks that I'll start making, but it's grown into something more than I had originally envisioned. Also, several people have commented on my dress. I don't normally dress this way. This is a homage to David Oberhelman. He would always dress very appropriately. He would dress in coat and tie. So this is to honor David today. You probably won't see me again like this for quite a while. All right, Plowshares and Pruning Hooks, Oklahoma A&M College, and the Great War. The Great War in Europe started in August of 1914, and for the next 2 years, public opinion in the United States was widely distributed between 2 extremes of those who wanted to rush to the aid of either the British, or in some cases the Germans, and others who wished to stay out of the war entirely. Through 1916, President Woodrow Wilson attempted to negotiate peace between the combatants, and the United States officially remained neutral, while slowly increasing its contributions in raw materials, supplies, and financial support to the Allies. It is not until 1917 that the tide began to turn in favor of those who supported going to war with the Allies, going to war with the Allies, and the efforts of President Wilson and others to keep us out of the Great War had failed. This was the case in Oklahoma as well as its land-grant college in Stillwater. Before the declaration of war, Oklahomans were divided in their opinions. By the time President Wilson and the United States declared war on April 6, 1917, neutrality was no longer favored. In 1917, Oklahoma was a young state, still in its first decade, and Oklahoma Agricultural Mechanical College had only held classes for 25 years. Both institutions were still establishing their foundations and traditions, and the small college would be greatly influenced by the trends in the surrounding communities and the state. The tide in Oklahoma citizen opinion quickly changed to public support for the war, beginning with the appointment of the Oklahoma State and local councils of defense. Increasingly, Oklahomans felt they had a role to play in making the world safe for democracy, and all voices opposed to this proposition were silenced. This same could be said for Oklahoma A&M. Okay, so the title of this presentation was inspired by the manufacturing of farm tools, all right? The practical collaboration of agriculture and engineering, the perfect blend of our land-grant heritage. Plowshares and pruning hooks are common tools used to increase food production, but they can also be reformed into swords and spears. instruments of death. But we will talk more about this later. For now, let's start this story. Oops. Okay. Perhaps it would be helpful to start by going back 50 years before World War I to the Land-Grant College Act of 1862, more commonly known as the Morrill Act, named for Senator Justin Morrill, who had been its leading supporter. Oklahoma A&M College was founded in 1890 through the provisions of the first and second Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890. The original act provided higher education opportunities for the first time to the industrial classes and included expectations for the type of education they would be provided. I don't think we need to read through the whole thing, but I want to just mention the highlighted section, which included military tactics. Okay? Let's see. So, Robert Barker, now you all should remember this. Robert Barker is the first president of Oklahoma A&M, and the reason I can remember his name when anyone asks me a question is, I think of the longest serving game show host for The Price of Right, Bob Barker. So if you ever question who the first president of Oklahoma A&M College is, just think of Price is Right, game show host, Bob Barker. Okay, so Robert Barker, the first president of Oklahoma A&M, before he did the game show thing, interpreted the mandate created by the United States during the Civil War to provide military tactics for all students, male and female. Both men and women students at Oklahoma A&M were required to participate in military drill until a clarification later released female students from this obligation. Not all students could afford the official uniform, and in the early years, a variety of outfits could be found on participants in the disorganized military drills. The first uniforms consisted of gray coats, trousers, and caps with black shoes and ties. Military science instruction was provided in class lectures, and drills were held daily for 3 hours. That seems exorbitant to me, but idle feet, I guess, make the devil's workshop. So they kept them busy out on the drill field. Okay. Oops. This strong military training tradition continued through the formative decades of the college. Stillwater and Payne County students dominated enrollments until Oklahoma statehood in 1907, and local communities felt a strong kinship with the college. The Corps of Cadets formed around 1910. Membership entailed 3 hours of drill each week, seems more reasonable, and included instruction in small arms firing, field service regulation, interior guard duty, infantry drill, and first aid. By 1913, military equipment support at the OAMC campus included 450 Craig Jorgensen rifles. These were 30 caliber rifles. Within a few years, this grew to 600 rifles, both Craig Jorgensens and Springfields, with additional unspecified military or infantry equipment. Not sure what that was. As the war was beginning in Europe, the college in Stillwater was facing some challenges of its own. Enrollment had grown to 1,471 students, so we're still a relatively small place in 1914, and campus facilities fell far short of current needs. College President J.H. Cannell had been removed from his position during the summer of 1914 due to financial irregularities and corruption issues related to his appointment of political friends to faculty and staff positions on campus. The college was unable to identify a permanent replacement, and so appointed Lowry Lehman Lewis as interim president. Let's see. On August 7th, the main campus administration office and classroom building, known as Morrill Hall, was gutted by fire. 2 months later, the relatively new women's building had a fire which destroyed the top 2 floors, and water damage occurred on the first and second floors. The European War was rarely mentioned in the college paper, as the college was more concerned with its own survival. Funding was secured to rebuild the 2 buildings severely damaged by the fires of 1914, and in June of 1915, James W. Cantwell was named as the new college president. He moved into temporary offices in the engineering building until Morrill Hall was restored. Cantwell set about to work to expand campus facilities and identify new revenue streams to support campus programs. Working with the Oklahoma Board of Agriculture, these were our regents at the time, The new president also applied for a federal program to provide Reserve Officer Training Corps on campus. The college had been placed under the Oklahoma Board of Agriculture in 1912. So formerly we had our own regents, then in 1912 we were placed under the State Board of Agriculture. And its board president, Frank Galt. Galt had little experience working in higher education. He was a former deputy marshal, peace officer, and cattle breeder. In support of the Lever Act of Congress, the Board of Agriculture encouraged the college to enforce and to expand food production and distribution programs in Oklahoma as the United States began to prepare domestically for war. Dramatically increasing grain prices, and this is from 1913 to 1919, grain prices increased by 400%. Helped propel the Great Plow-Up, which we're familiar with, as Western Oklahoma farmers expanded wheat acreages in the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas, eventually leading to the Dust Bowl a decade later. While Cantwell was working to build a foundation preparing for increased food production at home and battle overseas, students on campus were still conflicted. The Philomethian Literary Society debated entrance into the war, and the college newspaper supported their conclusion that the United States should not enter the present European war, and that was definitely proven last Saturday night by the Philomethians. Many students expressed concerns about militarism on campus the first years of the war, and this is the first years of the war in Europe. We're not in it yet. Ella Wilson was recognized in the college paper with her article in support of peace called The Aftermath. It was published in the Christian Herald in November of 1916. She stated that war would lead to desolation. The newspaper also provided reports of war news, but included stories that were less supportive. A sophomore, M.C. Graham, was featured in one article in which he referred to his 3 years in the military with the statement, "Army life is a great place for a man who has 3 years to waste." Meanwhile, cadet drills continued daily on the parade grounds between the Central Building and Morrill Hall, as well as north of Morrill Hall. As the campus continued discussions of the war, the Stillwater community demonstrated general support for the military. Stillwater hosted the Grand Army of the Republic, this is a reunion of Union soldiers, and the Spanish War veterans for their annual encampments. Holiday parades in town provided opportunities for military displays and a military and marching band, and was eventually added to these public displays for drill exercises. The precision and military dress had improved dramatically from the early years. The military section of the college yearbook also expanded every year beginning in 1914, culminating in the military issue in 1918 and the victory issue in 1919. Okay. In addition to the traditional cadet military training program, the new RTC units established in 1916, there were added rifle teams and a rifle club. Military Cadet Corps consisted of 8 companies, A through H, each with 40 members. This is a total of 320 members in the Cadet Corps. There were then 50 to 60 Rifle Club members, which was much smaller, but there existed some overlap between the two groups. Then the rifle team was even smaller, restricted to 15 members. And there was a women's rifle club, which was known as the Death Legion. The third governor of Oklahoma, Robert L. Williams, took office in January of 1915, only 6 months before Cantwell had arrived in Stillwater. Williams was the first governor to move into the new Capitol building completed in Oklahoma City in 1917. When the United States officially entered the war on April 6, 1917, Governor Williams began working with the United States Council of National Defense to establish the Oklahoma Council of Defense. The Oklahoma legislature was not in session, but this didn't deter Williams from establishing this extra-legal council. In May of 1917, he appointed a 12-member board with 11 committees. They were to address publicity, military preparedness, conservation of food and fuel, local food production, victory gardens, promote the sale of Liberty bonds, support the Red Cross, encourage the use of war saving stamps, and expand the capacity within the state to increase production of munitions and supplies in support of the war effort. By July, county and community councils of defense were organized as the governor appointed local businesses and civic leaders to work with their local populations. In Payne County, the governor named President Cantwell to the local council. The Oklahoma Council of Defense provided weekly news releases distributed to local newspapers and created an Oklahoma Patriotic Speakers Bureau. Let's see, I'm going to go on to the next one here. Well, maybe not, I'll wait up. Former Oklahoma A&M President Angelo C. Scott wrote a pamphlet titled "The War, Its Justification and Purpose" that was distributed to over 3,000 volunteer speakers. Known as the 4 Minutemen, they spoke to civic groups, schools, volunteer organizations, service groups, and a wide variety of small and large crowds. The speeches provided justification for entering the war, described the German atrocities. I was having trouble with my French earlier now. And encouraged support for the military. There we go, there's Angelo C. Scott. Okay. An Oklahoma Loyalty Bureau was also organized that hired Secret Service agents to work in local communities to identify citizens suspected of sedition and disloyalty. On some occasions, they cooperated with the KKK. Intimidation in some communities led to extreme measures. Some suspects were whipped with leather straps, tarred and feathered. Individuals and businesses were sometimes painted yellow if it had been determined they were disloyal. Oklahoma banned the use of the German language, and towns such as Bismarck and Kiel changed their names to Wright and Loyal. Oklahomans who didn't buy Liberty bonds were called slackers, which also became a common description for those who avoided the draft or didn't plant victory gardens. Intimidation and suspicion led to several difficult situations on the OAMC campus. A Stillwater dentist, F.R. Green, accused Gustav Frederick Brommel, and that's him circled there, of poisoning student minds. Brommel had been born in Germany and studied at the universities of Leipzig and Kiel. He was department head and distinguished professor of foreign languages and a well-known and respected faculty member at the college, active in a number of organizations. Mrs. Brommel was a patient of Green's. Green, collecting information from harmless conversations, local gossip, and his other patients, wrote to the editor of the Daily Oklahoman, Walter M. Harrison, accusing the couple of aggravated disloyalty. The state health commissioner, Dr. John W. Duke, wrote directly to the governor, Governor Williams, that the Brommels had made themselves quite obnoxious to all the loyal citizens in that community. Duke went on to inform the governor that the German Kaiser's picture hangs in their sitting room. None of this was true, an early edition of fake news. Another member of the Foreign Language Department and close friend of Professor Brommel's was Alman Arnold, who was also accused of disloyalty based only on local gossip that he spoke German. Fritz Wilhelm Redlich, originally from Stuttgart, Germany, and a member of the architecture faculty, fell under suspicion simply because his name, place of birth, and accent caused suspicion. Captain C.D. Dudley, who served as Commandant of the Cadet Corps, accused the director of the military band, Emile Makovski, of performing music at a campus performance with a German patriotic air. Harrison, who is the editor of the Oklahoman, felt the charges were unsubstantiated, and though pressured from Governor Williams and Frank Galt to fire any disloyal employees, Cantwell refused to fire or reprimand Brommel, Arnold, Redlich, or Makovski because of such flimsy accusations. But all 14 German language and literature courses were eliminated from the fall of 1917 through the 1919 calendar year. Brommel was heartbroken. The faculty member resigned. His family moved to Chicago, where he died the following year at age 56. After the war was declared, the requirements for food, soldiers, and engineers increased dramatically. Oklahoma A&M would assist with all three. Victory gardens were promoted on campus, and Extension Service shared food preservation techniques. Entomology professor C.E. Sanborn developed a beekeeping class to promote the production of honey and help families deal with the sugar shortage. It may have been the first correspondence course the college ever offered. Students needing to help their families with farm operations were allowed to leave college classes on April 26, 1917 to return home. So that's only roughly 3 weeks after the war was declared. For the next 18 months, President Cantwell received hundreds of letters from their parents requesting draft deferments so they could continue to help them on the farm. And farmers were encouraged to experiment with the production of flour from cottonseed, corn, and potatoes. Faculty shortages required some to teach classes on the periphery of their expertise. Dairy science professor Arthur C. Baer, who was known as Teddy, taught classes in chemistry and bacteriology. Physical education director Edward Gallagher, who had just started coaching wrestling a year earlier and had never been a wrestler, volunteered to teach wrestling to military cadets for self-defense situations in hand-to-hand combat. Gallagher also organized a new event at the annual state interscholastic competition. The campus newspaper announced the Throwing Hand Grenade event. And I'll read from the article here. Throwing hand grenades will be a new and novel feature of the 10th annual state interscholastic track and field meet to be held in Stillwater May 3rd and 4th under the auspices of Oklahoma Agricultural Mechanical College. Coach Gallagher is now arranging for the contest. The throwers will stand in a trench 6.5 feet deep by 3 feet wide and will hurl a grenade from 100 to 125 feet at an area 10 feet wide and running parallel to the trench. Accuracy and not distance will be the aim of the throwers. Sergeant Major Michael McDonald, this is not the guy who later takes over the Doobie Brothers, but I remember him by the Doobie Brothers guy. So anyway, Sergeant Major Michael McDonald was in charge of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. He also taught military science and tactics. He worked closely with the First Lieutenant George W. Ewell, who was Commandant of Students until called into action. Ewell and McDonald would run their student soldiers through competitive exercises and sham battles. One article describes such an event. It was a bright, crisp day in May when A&M's regiment went forth to war. One would not think that students of an institution would stand up and calmly shoot one another down, but that's the way they do it in Oklahoma. The annual sham battle produced excitement, exhaustion, and sometimes desertion. Female students cooked meals, held picnics, and observed the events unfolding as the male cadets dug trenches, marched through the wooded farms, and fired their rifles while wearing gas masks. After the battle concluded, the officers led the cadets to the closest pub where they drank beer purchased by the defeated. Ewell and McDonald were also to train general students, so these are just general students in the college, wanting to become teachers. This was in response to a state Board of Education mandate that all teachers in the rural schools, high schools, state normal schools, universities, the state training schools, and the Oklahoma State School for Dependent and Orphan Children were to teach students 8 years or older military training at least one period each day. Governor Williams also proposed replacing sports programs in all schools with military training. He stated, "I am going to propose a measure in the next legislature to abolish football," what was he thinking, "and baseball in all state schools and institute military training instead of athletics." As the campus reconfigured its student services, some changes were more obvious than others. Ben, he was known as Big Ben, Banks, director of the food services, instituted a food conservation program and worked closely with other groups planting victory gardens to ensure that they had the produce needed to integrate into the cafeteria and that they had things, they were planting the things they needed. Okay. President Cantwell also had grander plans in mind. He proposed building a new science building and a new gymnasium. War efforts delayed construction, especially the purchase of steel, but with the expanded military training programs on campus, he suggested that the new physical education facility be called the Armory MJs. This simple suggestion advanced the campus request for steel girders for the new armory up the priority list of steel supplied by federal authorities monitoring its distribution. Women on campus expanded their active role in the war effort. The women became more involved in student government and campus publications, very similar to what would happen during World War II. They participated in military training, sold Liberty bonds and war savings stamps, established a campus Red Cross chapter, created a student loan fund, and wrote letters to classmates training stateside and serving overseas. They also monitored returning letters from OAMC students in the trenches in France, which were printed in the orange and black. That's the college paper at the time. But there were very few other newspaper stories about the war. And that's a picture of the Death Legion. Wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley at night. Okay. Cadets were able to purchase better uniforms as they prepared for war. The new uniforms would be United States Army regulation and hold their shape better. The former Commandant Ewell claimed that he had worn his for 10 years. The band was also able to purchase military-style uniforms to match. Emile Makovski had only been on campus a few years before the war started, but he had developed an excellent reputation as director of the military marching band and conductor of the orchestra. The marching band would accompany cadets during their drill and parades both on and off campus, as well as participate in supporting many athletic events. May of 1917, former OAMC students began leaving Stillwater for training camps in Arkansas and Texas. The first group of 82 left for Little Rock, Arkansas. They had already experienced digging trenches, building temporary bridges, reading maps, and living in camps. The on-campus camps had been placed east of the athletic fields. Okay. Student Army Training Corps. So in early 1918, less than a year after the United States entered the war, President Cantwell told the Board of Agriculture that 600 current and former students from the college had already enlisted in the armed services. United States government and colleges across the country quickly realized that these enlistments were pulling too many students out of college without the skills, trades, and training they would be required by the military for successful completion of the war. They would need engineers, architects, managers, and mechanics to design and build bridges, run the supply logistics, and repair planes, tanks, trucks, automobiles, radios, and the other equipment of war. Keeping these men in college while beginning their military training became a top priority. In February of 1918, the United States Department of War established the Student Army Training Corps, and the government announced that its intention to establish a military unit in every college that could furnish a minimum of 100 able-bodied men of military age. Cantwell arranged for Oklahoma A&M to become one of the 525 institutions nationwide to train draftees in a variety of trades needed for the war effort, and it was jointly administered by the military and the college. In the spring of 1918, the War Department signed contracts with Oklahoma A&M and many of the other colleges which had been established through the Morrill Act with the intent of creating technical training centers to utilize the expertise and equipment of their mechanical departments. Trainees in the Student Army Training Corps would also receive intensive military preparation under the direction of Army officers provided to the institution through the War Department. Oklahoma A&M passed the War Department's inspection, and male students were able to stay in college while beginning their non-officer military training. Men who did well in their academic classes and military exercises were transferred to the RTC officer training program on campus. President Cantwell affirmed that all male students, except those who were unfit for military service or those who were below the draft age, were required to enroll voluntarily in the SATC, the Student Army Training Corps at OAMC. They received the rank of private. SATC training was scheduled to begin on July 18, 1918, and would last at least 3 months. However, there would be delays in its implementation. The college had to provide a new building with increased dining hall space and make a number of alterations to existing facilities before the first student soldiers arrived on campus. The military was to reimburse the institution for the costs, room and board, and other other things related to the training. Move on. All men's dormitories were remodeled, and the remodeled Livestock Pavilion housed 343 men. So that was, this upper left there was our Livestock Pavilion, and they reworked that facility as a dormitory, as a residence hall. The 90-day program began September of 1918. When the war ended on November 11th, 1918, so they hadn't even completed the first series of trainings, the federal government abandoned the plan. Cantwell took quick action to arrange for the purchase at bargain prices of surplus Army gas combustion engines and additional machinery to help the School of Engineering broaden its base. Okay. The Girls Student Association was instrumental in creating a flag of honor acknowledging students who served in the war. It was taken to events around the state to remind audiences of the college's contribution to the war effort. White stars were used and then gold stars placed on the white star to represent those who died. The flag was huge, 13.5 by 28 feet, and had 693 stars. The first flag was reported missing in 1923. The disappearance resulted in extensive search across campus, but it was never found. The class of 1927 and the Alumni Corporation replaced the flag. The second flag was even larger, 20 by 28 feet, and it cost $500. It took 7 weeks to complete. Each service member's name was embroidered on their star. It was used only for special occasions and stored in a locked vault for protection. It also disappeared several years later. Student soldiers began leaving for military training and combat in the summer of 1917, and these farewells continued for the next 18 months. Now I'd like to return back to the title of the presentation, Plowshares and Pruning Hooks. It comes from Old Testament scripture. I'd like to share 2 verses from the book of Joel, Joel 3, 9 through 10. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the soldiers draw near. Let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Okay, I'd like to focus briefly on the impact war has on people who serve and those who wait for them. There are 4 individual stories from OAMC students that I would like to briefly share with you. They are Raymond Hurst, Carter Hanner, Stillwater's not on the map, but you know where it is, then George Hayes and Aldous Loganville. Raymond Hurst, an OAMC student from Pocasset, Oklahoma, enlisted on October 3, 1917. He was a private in the 1st Engineering Corps serving as a bugler. In February of 1918, he was on board the ship Tuscania with over 2,000 American soldiers being transported to England as part of a British convoy. The Tuscania was torpedoed by a German submarine on February 5th along the coastal islands between Ireland and Scotland. The ship did not sink immediately, and the majority of its passengers were rescued. However, 210 people either died from the initial explosion or drowned. Raymond Hurst's body was found along the coast of Scotland. He was buried at Port Charlotte in a small cemetery created for the victims. It would take 10 days for the news of his death to reach Stillwater. 2 years later, his remains were moved to Oklahoma City, and Hurst was buried with full military honors. Raymond was the first combat victim with ties to Oklahoma A&M. Carter Carey Hanner. Carter Hanner had been a student 2 decades earlier. Born in Illinois, the Hanner family had moved to Stillwater in 1893 when Carter was 14. He enrolled as a student at Oklahoma A&M and then quit in 1898 to enlist for the Spanish-American War. He was sent to the Philippines and served for 3 years. Returning to Stillwater, he joined the Oklahoma National Guard and spent some time on the Mexican border before the U.S. entrance into World War I. After additional training, his unit sailed for France on July 4th, 1918, to join the American Expeditionary Force under the command of General John Blackjack Pershing. On September 6th, he was promoted to captain and placed in command of Company E, 142nd Infantry, 36th Division, and promoted to captain on October 4th is when he was promoted to captain. So he joins that unit and is promoted to captain on October 4th. 4 days later, Captain Hanner was killed on the battlefield in the Argonne Forest and later awarded the Croix de Guerre. It's passable, okay. By France for his gallantry in action. Hanner is buried at the American Cemetery at Romagna. Thank you. France. He was survived by his wife and 3 young children. The news of his death arrived only days before the announcement of the armistice ending the war. When the 2 new residence halls, one for women and one for men, were constructed on the campus of Oklahoma A&M in 1925, OAMC President Bradford Knapp submitted 2 potential names to the Board of Agriculture for the men's dormitory. Carter C. Hanner, and Raymond Thomas Hurst. On Armistice Day 1925, the Residence Hall was dedicated to the memory of Carter Hanner, with the crowd inspired to rededicate themselves to service. George Hayes was born in China, where his parents were serving as missionaries. After completing their mission, the Hayes family moved to a farm between El Reno and Akarchi, where he grew up before enrolling in the engineering school at Oklahoma A&M. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1917, and by July 14, 1918, he was a first lieutenant serving with the 10th Field Artillery Regiment, 3rd Division. And so the Second Battle of the Marne began late on July the 14th with a German advance across the Marne River, roughly 50 miles east of Paris. Let me read the official General Order 34. This is from March 7th, 1919, War Department. The President of the United States, in the name of Congress, takes pleasure in presenting the Medal of Honor to First Lieutenant, Field Artillery, George Price Hayes, United States Army, for extraordinary heroism on July 14th and 15th, 1918, while serving with the 10th Field Artillery, 3rd Division, in action at Greaves Farm, France. At the very onset of the unprecedented artillery bombardment by the enemy, First Lieutenant Hayes' lines of communication were destroyed beyond repair. Despite the hazard, attached to the mission of runner, he immediately set out to establish contact with the neighboring posts of command and further establish liaison with 2 French batteries, visiting their positions so frequently that he was mainly responsible for the accurate fire from them. While thus engaged, 7 horses were shot from under him, and he was severely wounded. His activity under most severe fire was an important factor in checking the advance of the enemy. General Pershing personally awarded George Hayes the Congressional Medal of Honor. Hayes would return to school in Stillwater, complete his degree, and then remain in the military for the rest of his life, rising to the rank of Lieutenant General and serving in World War II on the beaches of Normandy and in the Italian Alps. Okay. Now I'm going to read a second set of scripture. This is also from the Old Testament. This is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Aldous Loganville was born in Missouri, and the Loganville family moved to Carey, Oklahoma in February of 1907. Two of his father's sisters were serving as Mennonite missionaries to the Cheyenne Arapaho, and the Loganville family wanted to be closer to them. In 1916, Aldous traveled to Stillwater to enroll in the practical course in agriculture at Oklahoma A&M. He attended the fall semester of 1916 and the spring semester of 1917. While at OAMC, he was enrolled in English, public speaking, grain crops, carpentry, farm arithmetic, farm machinery, and physical education. While on the wheat harvest during the summer of 1917, his parents received his draft notice. As a Mennonite conscientious objector, he requested non-combatant service and was assigned to take care of horses at Camp Travis near San Antonio, Texas. There were 4 other young men from the Carey Mennonite Church in his unit. Their minister traveled from Carey periodically until he was threatened with being tarred and feathered if he returned. COs, conscientious objectors, at Fort Travis were not given blankets and slept on newspapers. They also suffered ridicule, intimidation, and beatings from other soldiers. The results of this treatment led to kidney problems for Aldous. After serving 18 months, he was released from Camp Travis in the spring of 1919, and he returned home to Carey. His health never recovered, and he died of kidney failure on January 4th, 1927. He was survived by his wife and 3 children. Aldous Loganville was not listed among the former OAMC students who served their country during World War I. Oklahoma was particularly tough on pacifists and conscientious objectors. They were threatened with lynching in parts of the state. Henry Reimer in Collinsville was unconscious and hanging from an electrical cord until the assistant chief of police cut him down and then charged Reimer with contempt. 45 conscientious objectors were court-martialed at Camp Travis in Texas and sentenced to life in prison, later commuted to 25 years at Leavenworth. 25% of the CEOs at Leavenworth came from Oklahoma. Most were freed at the end of the war, but the Oklahoma State Legislature passed a resolution strongly condemning the amnesty decree. In Oklahoma, they were considered slackers, cowards, disloyal, and anti-American. Aldous Loganville was one of these. He did not request a deferment to help his father on the farm or to continue his education. Aldous enlisted when drafted and was persecuted for doing so. Okay, so at the cessation of the war, a 2-page questionnaire with an accompanying letter was distributed to all former students and staff that had been identified with military service on our campus. It was signed by President Cantwell, the yearbook editor, Maud Cass, librarian, Margaret Walters, and Professor Maroney from the history department. Almost 400 responded, and this is a part of our Content DM collection, OAMC, in World War I. So if you're interested in knowing more about that collection, go to that. It included a variety of information, name, rank, and ceremony, where they served, were they wounded, where they traveled, what their experiences were, what their perspectives were on various things. It wasn't real elaborate, but it did cover the front and back of a 2-page sheet. Here's an example. So what you have here is many of them included photographs, and some of them included a photograph, but they wanted it returned. Especially if it was a mother, she would say, "This is the only picture I have of Fred. You know, you can use it for now, but send it back to me." But they would include photographs not only of themselves, but of some of their experiences. Here they are in some training activities. I think the one on the left is at Fort Travis. Claude McElroy served in the Chesapeake Bay on the coast defense. But what was interesting to me is his last comment was he was very supportive of the League of Nations. He thought that was something that needed to be enacted. Here's a graduate student, Ralph McBurney. Here's with his gas mask and without his gas mask. He served in the Medical Corps. He was in the Argonne Musée battle. That was in October 1918. And I believe at least three OAMC soldiers died in that battle. Here's one from Jess Hoke. There's a category, wounded, where, and when. So he's asking the question, is flu a wound? And then he was shot in the back 3 times. He got a typhoid shot. He got 3 typhoid shots. So that's Jess. He also described the SATC as the slacker Army Training Corps, of which he was a part. So at least Jess had a sense of humor about him. Okay. There was another, I didn't include it, but Thomas Aycock, who wrote under his personal impressions, "The worst war I was ever in." It's probably the only war he was ever in. Okay. Well, for impacts to the campus and other things, the most significant statistics are that 1,438 men and women, and there were 3 women, and the little handouts in the upper right-hand corner, that is Ethel Bodenstein, and she worked in the Red Cross, but she was an OAMC student, but provided service to a variety of roles. 29 of these men died. 5 were from Stillwater. 15 were decorated by the Allied nations. War seems to bring out the best and worst in humanity. Okay. The facilities on campus changed because of the war. The athletic fields for football and track, known as Lewis Field in honor of L.L. Lewis, were relocated and reoriented. The fields had run north and south, just west of where the new gymnasium and armory were constructed, and the completion of that facility moved the athletic fields to the north and east, where they are located today. It was also realigned to go east and west. After the war, President Cantwell purchased or transferred, and I mentioned this earlier, discarded gas engine equipment that was considered part of the military surplus. These were tractors, tanks, and other vehicles. They were brought to campus for use in the engineering school. Enrollments before and during the war never exceeded 2,000, but after the war, our enrollments blossomed, and after 1922, would never be below 2,000 again. Cantwell's plans to expand facilities such as the new science building helped increase the capacity of the college to meet these new expectations. After the war, Cantwell saw to it that the college assisted with the vocational training of disabled combat veterans under a law from the Congress. These were known as federal students, kind of a precursor to the GI Bill. Such students each received a federal scholarship. Initially, about 200 men came to the college, with more to follow over the next several decades. These men and their families became staunch supporters of the institution. The dedication and sacrifices made during First World War, the Great War, another war to end all wars, would be remembered throughout the year, but especially during Armistice Day, which is November 11th. Soldiers, students, families, and friends would gather on campus for decades to share expressions of gratitude for the services performed during and after the war. The Alumni Association proposed a memorial arch that was estimated to cost $10,000 to honor alumni participation in the war. In 1926, President Bradford Knapp recommended that Old Central be removed and replaced with a $100,000 clock tower built on the footprint of the old building. The tower would serve as a memorial to the 1,400 plus soldiers from the institution who had been involved in World War I. Neither of these structures were built. If you have a chance to visit the Bennett Memorial Chapel, there is a plaque on the wall to the right as you enter. It describes the 29 who passed. Sometimes the best remembrances are those we keep in our hearts. Questions or comments? Yes?
I was wondering, when you were talking about the relationship between the kids that were getting military training, was that actually supported by the government and then those kids were transferred to, like you say, Fort Travis, or was it separate?
So if they were in the ROTC program,
Yeah.
or the Student Army Training Corps, which never had a graduating class,
Yeah.
those were supported by the government.
Okay. So was this common throughout the United States then, not just in Oklahoma? Or was it an A&M institution thing that did this? I mean,
It was common. It was very common, especially amongst the land-grant schools.
yeah.
Yeah. Many of them were, but there were also Quakers, Friends. I'm trying to think. There were several other groups. The ones that seemed to be picked on were the Mennonites, because most of them were of German heritage and only been in this country a few short years. Some of them were sons and daughters of immigrants. So not only did they speak German, but they were pacifists. So they seemed to be highlighted. So. Not in a good way. Yeah.
Was it difficult to piece all this together? Did the library archives and information here provide most all of this for you?
The library archives is an excellent department. So yes, at least 95% of this is from our archival material. And a lot of it is from the questionnaires, and then we have the yearbooks from that time period. We have the newspapers have all been digitized, and those are available online. And so it's really, we consider that the archive, but it's a collaboration with all of the library and the resources the library provides. But yes, and we have then a number of images, photographs, and then it's kind of been mashed together. I also depended very strongly on the Centennial History series. Each of those, there was 25 volumes in that series that was done over 25 years ago, but each of those volumes has some mention of the war or some aspect of the war. Even human sciences, home economics at the time, refers to the creation of the service flag and the women's involvement in that. They also mentioned the women providing picnics and food during these sham battles. So, but there was information in all of those.
Do you know if, and I know this is past what you're talking about, but do you know how long the antagonism towards the German faculty and any German people in Stillwater, how long this went on?
The severity of it declined fairly quickly after the war was over.
Okay.
So once there was no longer a threat, it declined fairly quick. There were still underlying suspicions, and that extended into World War II. And so that continues on, and especially in Oklahoma. And I'm not sure, I mean, it was occurring in other states also, but we seem to hold a grudge or something, or a...
Yeah, I know there were a lot of German settlements in Kansas. I'm guessing that they were also in Oklahoma.
Right.
German settlements, so maybe that was part of it. That's interesting.
Yeah, but it continued on.
Yeah.
But it declined. So during the war, it rises. After the war, it declines. And then it increases again during World War II, and then begins a decline. But now the pacifist stand isn't nearly as strong in many of those Mennonite communities. A number of them have done alternative service.
I wonder how long it was before they taught German again. I don't know.
So I'll give you an example from my
Yeah.
own experience. My parents both learned German at home. They didn't learn any English till they started school. And my dad would have been, 12 when World War II started. So we're in the 30s still, and they're speaking German at home, not learning English until they go to school. But once they went to school, then they were forced to learn English. And so I know with my grandparents, if they were in public, they used English. If they were in private, around the family, around home, they used German. They picked their audience, is what they did. They were much more selective in the language they used. And if they didn't want the grandchildren to know what they were talking about, they spoke Plautdeutsch, which is Low German. It was another version of it. So if they went into Plautdeutsch, we tried to listen more intently because we knew they were talking about something that impacted us, but we couldn't figure out what they were saying.
Your talk was very heavy on individuals, on people. Why is it important to tell like people's story rather than like big battles or concepts?
Because I think the individual stories are really more meaningful for me. I mean, that's where a story lies in each of our own hearts. You know, the big battles, it's good to understand. That provides the context, that provides the overarching significance of things. But ultimately, it's in our own hearts where we feel these things. And so that's why I try to focus on individuals. That's why I try to focus on those 4 individuals. You know, 2 who survived, at least initially, 2 who did not. But there's a real investment by individuals. And so I try to place them in what the context was of where they were when things happened to them. But I also wanted to mention like the 2 gentlemen who both had a wife and 3 children. One died, one survived at least initially, but then died a few years later. But I think that's where we feel things. So, sure.